Has JD Vance influenced this ticket in a way that worries you?
Well, first off, I'm glad about JD getting the pick. He's a friend of mine. We differ on this issue, but I think that you've seen some changes in position from President Trump, and I'll let JD and President Trump sort out any differences they may have. But the fact that we were able to get the supplemental funding done.
Yes.
And getting Republican support suggests to me that that there's an increasing understanding that if Putin wins in Ukraine, then we're gonna lose the momentum that we need for maintaining a check against China. The Ukraine conflict is about the Ukrainian people, Eastern Europe, and the South China Sea in China.
Well, as you think about what it took to get that supplemental done, House Speaker Mike Johnson kind of had to have a change of heart. He said he saw intelligence and it changed his mind. Is that what might need to happen with the vice presidential nominee?
Absolutely. We also have to understand the $60 billion in the supplemental, 2/3 of it never left our shores. The only thing that left our shores were actually equipment that is backfilling inventories that are being sent to Ukraine. So the American people need to know we're being good stewards of their dollars. We are modernizing NATO. I'm the Republican lead of the Senate NATO Observer Group since 2018. We are modernizing NATO's arsenal at a faster pace than any time in its 75-year history. And I think once we explain all those details, that we'll gain support, we'll sustain the effort, and Putin simply cannot win a sustained commitment from the United States. Without United States leadership, the coalition to support Ukraine fails.
Joe Biden has said he's done more for NATO than any other president, that everyone in the NATO alliance supports him in his bid for re-election. He was picked up on a Zoom call with some Democrats last weekend, forcefully making that point. Considering your unique view on it, what do you think?
I respectfully disagree. President Donald J. Trump is responsible for going from only 9 members paying their 2% share and 23 not, to 23 members at the end of this year paying their share and 9 not. Canada being one that I have a particular concern with, but that didn't happen on President Biden's watch. That's because President Trump made it very clear that we all need to work on our mutual defense. Just to give you an idea of what we're talking about here, because we talk about percentage points, a 0.5 percentage point below 2%. Canada, because it's failed to make its 2% commitment in this century, over the last 24 years, has shorted NATO by $300 billion in today's dollars. That's about $500 billion that could have been modernizing our arsenal that Canada has not done. They've got to pay up. But all of that consciousness, the fact that we have 32 members and we have 23 paying their 2% share, is all on President Donald J. Trump.
Is this just about money, though? Joe Biden says he expanded NATO. No one else has pulled that off.
No, Vladimir Putin expanded NATO. No, quite frankly, I was there. I've been at the summits, and the Finland and Sweden would not have considered moving from a neutral position had Putin not invaded Ukraine. So Putin guaranteed 1,340 kilometers of NATO border now in Finland, and he guaranteed one of the best naval Arctic power projection in Sweden. But that's not that we have a saying down south that you can be a callous, you show up after the work's done. If President Biden saying that, he's kind of showing up after the work was done.
All right, so that's Europe and Russia. We'd like to ask you as well about China, but specifically how U.S. policy when it comes to China and trade with China specifically may be felt here at home. This is something we spoke about with earlier this week with Congressman French Hill of Arkansas of the House Financial Services Committee.
Across-the-board tariffs, if put in place and left in place, are inflationary. It's a tax, and it is borne by the American consumer. I think where President Trump demonstrated his ability to negotiate was using them, as I said earlier, as a cudgel to bring people to the table for a positive outcome, not just simply leave them in place.
He also talked about this on Wall Street Week with Bloomberg's David Weston earlier this month. But basically the idea is, and I know you have an understanding of this given your seat on the banking committee, you raise tariffs, you raise the cost of goods here at home. Is this inflationary policy that Trump and Vance are talking about
I couldn't
pursuing?
have said what French said better. He's exactly right. President Trump, if you think about how we got to the USMCA, a better version of NAFTA, it's because he was willing to at least contemplate the idea of postponing or canceling NAFTA. I think he has to have those devices available, but clearly across the board tariffs would be inflationary at the worst possible time as we're trying to get out of the nagging inflation we have here and the Fed meeting its dual mandate. But French Hill's absolutely right. President Trump should have that as a device. We also need to figure out how to regen TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and trade relations, too, with respect to strategic weapons to use against China.
Senator Tillis, I want to ask you about the convention itself. I suspect you'll be in the hall tonight.
Yeah, I had to come all the way to Milwaukee to see y'all.
Well, absolutely, as much as we'd like to think so.
Yeah.
The speaker's list is interesting. I know this has been a sort of unity theme, and we've heard a lot of that from Republican lawmakers who've come to visit us here. But we've got Hulk Hogan tonight, Dana White, fight, fight, fight. Are you a little bit worried about this getting a little too chippy?
I hope that everybody takes the president's lead. I communicated to the president that I was thrilled that he wants to have a convention that has a message of unity. I believe that the Republican Party is together. We have our differences. I've had my own differences with some members of the Republican Party, but we're coming out of Milwaukee united. And now we're not even sure if President Biden will be the nominee, and the Democrats are going to go into probably one of the most tumultuous conventions since 1968. So we have to stay focused on that message. That's what the American people want, and they're going to respond positively to the party that does that best between now and November.
Well, just because you brought it up, sir, if Joe Biden is not the nominee, what does the party need to change? If it's not Joe Biden at the top of the ticket and you can't make the issue just age.
Yeah. Well, the problem is they can't change the failure at the border. They can't change an economy that's nowhere near what it was when President Trump left office, and they can't change a posture on foreign policy that I think is dead wrong. So whoever runs, they're going to have to defend the legacy of an administration that I believe objectively is a failure. And look, I'm not a bomb thrower. I'm a businessman who happens to be a senator. And they've failed on all those fronts. And if the Republican Party focuses on that, we win, we bid big, and we will be in majorities in Congress, and we will win the White House.
Well, I'll tell you, there's a lot there as we consider the way forward and what we're going to learn tonight. Donald Trump's going to mention Kamala Harris, I suspect. Should he?
Well, I'll leave it to the president to decide what the president should say. But even when you're dealing with a vice president whose policies we served together on Judiciary Committee when she was a senator, you do it with respect. Let's win on ideas, and let's win on what's best for the American people. Let's not get into personal politics.
You were among the first to call for Joe Biden to drop out of this.
I've simply asked those who would be around him every day, the cabinet, to just affirm that he's a firm mind and body and able to make the tough decisions in the Situation Room between now and he exits office in January. We have to realize his day job is still calling on him. And presidents have to stay awake for 36 hours at a time and make very, very difficult decisions. And I'm wondering whether or not every member of the cabinet would, in fact, say they work with them. He's okay. He could do that very difficult job in the Situation Room when we're at when the nation is threatened. And I personally don't believe he's up to the task. But I'm willing to defer to every member of the cabinet to simply affirm formally that he is. I think the American people deserve that.
Finally, you obviously are a senator from North Carolina. We consider it a swing state. You have a Democratic governor. Could another Democrat other than Joe Biden win North Carolina, or do you see it as unwinnable for Democrats?
I frankly think they're out of runway. I really do. I think that President Trump wins the state, whether or not everybody down the ballot went. We're a tough state. A landslide in North Carolina if you win by one point. Both of my elections were 1.4 and 1.6. So I think President Trump's going to carry it strong, and he may carry some others down ballot. But yeah, there's no doubt if they're spending a lot of time in North Carolina, I don't think it's going to be time, attention, and
Roy Cooper's name keeps coming up as a potential running mate for Kamala Harris.
Yeah.
What kind of an impact would that have?
I'm not really sure. You know, I don't speak ill of individuals, but I'm not particularly impressed with his agenda in North Carolina, and there's a reason why. You're looking at the second Republican speaker in 100 years in North Carolina. We took control of the state in 2011. We transformed it, and Governor Cooper kind of showed up after the work was done.